Asia Tonight.
Good evening. Tonight's top stories. Business in focus for Australia's Prime Minister in China, Anthony Albanese, to meet government leaders, but in Shanghai first, touting green steel as a way to balance a crucial export with the need to cut emissions. The Chinese Foreign Minister hailing ties with Moscow as the world's most strategically valuable, on a visit by Russia's top diplomat. Sergei Lavrov stopping first in North Korea, with the ever-close alignment with Pyongyang likely not going unnoticed by neighbor to both China. And in business, China's exports grow at a faster clip in June, topping market estimates after a tentative deal with the US eased trade tensions. And also in East Asia tonight, it's not just fans who are looking forward to the return of BTS. Businesses in South Korea hope to get a lift as anticipation builds over the K-pop group's new album. Australia's Prime Minister continuing his push for more business with China in a trade environment under threat from US tariffs. Anthony Albanese holding a roundtable with Australian iron ore giants and key Chinese steelmakers. He says the two sides should work more closely over green steel or metal produced using renewable energy.
As both countries cooperate to advance decarbonisation, we also need to work together to address global excess steel capacity. It is in both countries' interests to ensure a sustainable and market-driven global steel sector.
Mr. Albanese will meet the Chinese president in Beijing tomorrow in their second face-to-face meeting since Mr. Albanese's re-election in May. But Canberra under pressure from needing to address security concerns about its largest trade partner, given its long-standing military alignment with the United States. At an event yesterday to promote tourism to Australia, Mr. Albanese was asked point-blank what Australia would do if the US and China were to go to war over Taiwan. This after reports that Washington had been asking that very same question.
I think it's important that we have a consistent position, which Australia has had for a long period of time. We support the status quo. When it comes to Taiwan, we don't support any unilateral action there. We have a clear position, and we have been consistent about that.
And we're joined by CNA's Deborah Wong. She's live from Shenzhen. Deborah, Mr. Albanese there, we heard, concerns about excess capacity on steel out of China, also concerns about damaging emissions that come from this industry. And also, as far as Australia is concerned, tens of billions of dollars of exports every year in iron ore to China for this industry. Why are all these issues of concern taken together, and how will the two sides likely address the issue?
Well, let's talk about the common interests first. Australia and China, they're both interested in the same thing. They're interested in steel decarbonization. They're interested in the production of green energy. So we saw the talks today very much focused on that aspect. We saw Australian iron ore exporters joining the delegation to China. They were also meeting with Chinese steelmakers. And in that roundtable discussion, they talked about changing the nature of furnaces. They're talking about decarbonization methods, perhaps including the use of hydrogen, as well as discussing potential areas of research and collaboration between the two countries. Now, iron ore production has been a major source of concern for the two countries. And this is also because China imports nearly 60% of its supply of iron ore from Australia. And that goes into Chinese steel production, which accounts for, over 50% of global supply. But Chinese 2030 decarbonization goals demand cleaner energy, from more renewable resources and also reduce steel capacity. So we're talking about a very major shift in, industrial supply processes right now. So this has, of course, rattled a lot of iron ore producers in Australia who are now trying to transit to green infrastructure so that they can stay relevant, they can stay competitive. So we're now seeing the bilateral partnership evolve from something that began as industrial partnership to something more of climate cooperation.
All right, Deborah, of course, Mr. Albanese in China for 6 days. He can afford to spread out his different themes. So today we're in Shanghai, trade, steel. Tomorrow he'll be in Beijing to meet President Xi Jinping, his second face-to-face since taking office.
So following the roundtable discussions that we saw today, it was very much focused on trade. We could expect discussions perhaps in the next couple of days, especially during the Leaders Summit, to perhaps look at some formal agreements. So today some of the industry leaders raised the possibility of enacting perhaps a formal bilateral agreement regarding green iron, so we could potentially look at that. Both sides are also expected to discuss deals on new growth areas such as artificial intelligence as well as the digital economy. So we must also remember that this meeting is happening against the backdrop of US global tariffs as well as the Pentagon pressuring Australia to clarify its position if China were to invade Taiwan. Now, internally, Australian officials have told local media that they don't discuss hypotheticals. And, we also heard before you came to me what the Prime Minister had to say. They're maintaining status quo on that stance. Even so, the Prime Minister has also backed his foreign minister's concerns about China's expanding military capability in the region. So we can still expect security issues to be discussed. This is also because Australia is involved in the AUKUS submarine pact with the US, and that deal has not set well with China, given that it's seeing it as a counterweight to China's own military capability in the region. But, currently, US President Trump's review of the AUKUS deal has not quite set well with its own members in the pact. So it will be quite interesting to see how Mr. Albanese navigates this discussion regarding security in the next couple of days.
Thanks. CNA's Deborah Wong live for us there from Shenzhen. And we stay on that theme. Earlier, Asia First spoke with Darren Lim. He's senior lecturer at the School of Politics and International Relations at ANU. Now, he looked at what Deborah explained, the difficulty with balancing relations with a security partner, the US, with trade partner, China.
Australia has clear conflicts of interest with China, but the United States is an increasingly unreliable partner. Now, our security relationship with the United States is long, and it is really impossible to imagine it being severely affected. So I think the interesting things to look for are at the margins, right? Are we going to develop slightly closer relationships with China than we otherwise would if there were, a more orthodox administration in place? China certainly wants greater involvement in the Australian economy. They want more foreign investment. They want Australia to embrace their technology stack on artificial intelligence. We've seen China's ambassador to Australia propose that Australia look to cooperate on AI. Now, we would expect normally that Australia would rebuff these advances. We like to keep our relationship with China at arm's length. We want to sell them many commodities, food and minerals, but we don't want them too involved in our domestic economy. And we did that through banning Huawei from our 5G network, back in 2018. But that's where the pressure points lie, right? Can China build a stronger presence here in Australia, embrace Australia a bit more tightly, rather than what I think the government would prefer, which is that arm's length relationship? Now, I'm not expecting any major concessions to be made, but that is where the absence of US leadership and erratic behaviour by the president could, over time, create those forces that push countries even like Australia slightly closer to China.
Darren, I want to ask you in a related matter, about this whole concept of strategic ambiguity. It's something that many countries have used for a long time now, including the United States, I should add. But I'm wondering if it's still going to work for Australia in this Trump era. I mean, can Australia continue to be a key US defense partner against China and still have unfettered access to Chinese markets and consumers?
Well, that exactly is the delicate dance that Prime Minister Albanese is looking to maintain and continue this week. Look, strategic ambiguity on the issue of Taiwan is a common sense approach. No one wants to commit in advance. There is an incentive to deter any unilateral actions by Beijing, but also an incentive to prevent Taiwan from doing anything to disrupt the status quo unilaterally. Australia supports the status quo, and for the moment, the US still does as well. But what your question gets at is this sort of bigger tension about whether or not maintaining a strong security relationship with the United States, which is essential. There is no other alternative. Our military is so intertwined with the US military that going it alone is just remains inconceivable for Australia. But whether maintaining that does jeopardize the economic relationship and the political relationship with Beijing. And Australia has learned in recent years how if you push out too far in one direction, that resulted in a backlash from China and a campaign of economic coercion, which saw us, $20 billion worth of economic trade affected. Now, I don't think it's in China's interest to push too hard, but that is the basic contradiction here. And it's not one that can be easily resolved. It requires very, very skilled and deft diplomacy, and that's what the Prime Minister is going to need to display this week.
Chinese Vice President Han Zheng has called for the steady advancement of practical cooperation while meeting in Beijing with Indian External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar. Mr. Han added that both nations should respect each other's concerns and promote relations. Dr. Jaishankar urged dialogue and continued normalization of ties to produce what he calls mutually beneficial outcomes. He also expressed confidence that discussions will maintain a positive trajectory. Dr. Jaishankar, meantime, is set to hold bilateral talks with his counterpart Wang Yi later today. He will also attend a meeting of foreign ministers of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Tianjin tomorrow. The Indian minister's visit to China is his first since 2020, when bilateral ties plummeted following a deadly clash along the line of actual control. With US President Donald Trump's tariffs set to take effect next month, many countries in Asia racing to cut a deal before that deadline. South Korea says it might be able to strike, quote, an in-principle trade deal with Washington by next month, with the time too short for a more detailed package. Trade Minister Johan Koo says Seoul might be able to turn the current zero-sum tariff deal into one which benefits both countries. He says cooperation with South Korea could help usher in a manufacturing renaissance in America via investments and collaboration in the semiconductor and defense sectors. Mr. Yeo says Seoul may have to make some strategic decisions over its agriculture market. While he touted considerable progress in discussions, he said Washington has to cut what he calls unfair tariffs on autos and steel, which he says severely undermine bilateral cooperation. Japan, meantime, hoping to further its negotiations. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent visiting the World Expo in Osaka this week. Despite multiple rounds of talks, Japan has yet to secure any concessions on its key auto sector. Tokyo has also refused to open its market to American rice. Observers expect Tokyo to re-engage in trade discussions only after its upper house elections on Sunday. Any concessions made ahead of that vote could spell disaster for the ruling party. Still ahead on East Asia tonight, a look at NTT-DC REIT's performance on its first trading day on the Singapore exchange. And later we'll look at what caused the collapse of a Japanese government-backed contract chip maker, despite a broader boom in the chip sector. And Roland Lim is standing by with business news. Roland, China's exports last month uptick in keeping with an existing trend, but still surprising some.
Yes, Wei Su. It's too soon to say, but some economists are warning against making a deduction that it's returning to normalcy. Some saying this recovery probably reflects efforts by US exporters, or importers, I beg your pardon, to stockpile Chinese goods. But the trade did grow faster than expected in the month of June after Washington and Beijing agreed a tentative deal to lower swinging tariffs at each other. Overseas shipments in US dollar terms rose 5.8% on year from 4.8% the previous month. Imports rose more than 1%, bouncing back from a 3.4% contraction in May amid strong domestic demand. China's two-way trade in yuan-denominated terms reached a record high in the first 6 months of the year, despite US imports and exports falling more than 9%. Still, China's Customs Department says that trade between the world's two biggest economies has recently shown signs of recovery. The figures cover the period after the US and China trade détente. But economists warn export growth would remain slow over the coming quarters as manufacturers are pressured to higher tariffs. Markets reacting cautiously to the positive trade data, investors also keeping their eyes on second quarter GDP figures. Shanghai Composite managing to inch higher, but in risk-off mode for Shenzhen, the Hang Seng Index also adding 0.3%. Saxo Singapore's CEO Mahesh Sesuraman says that China's recent numbers may not be enough to convince investors that the economy will be able to withstand the impact of US tariffs.
The noise in the data is quite high for a couple of reasons. One, there's a lot of front-loading from the US importers. I mean, the peak of that is behind us, but there's still quite a bit of front-loading going on, and that makes it difficult to decipher this data. And two, there's also been a couple of factors within China, right? One, the temporary tariff truce that you kind of alluded to has definitely made things a little easier for the quarter. And also some of the deflationary measures that Chinese authorities took seems to have helped the data as well. But as I said again, the data is very, very noisy, and there's quite a lot of front-loading going on. And a lot of the world is still to figure out how to deal with the tariff war if this becomes more permanent. Right now, we are rolling over tariff war every month and every quarter. And even now, we are talking about August 1st, but there's no guarantee that it will not be kicked further down the road. I think the data, even the survey data shows that the 5% GDP growth rate has been achieved for the last 2 quarters, which is pretty good. But having said that, there's quite a lot of noise in the data, and it's just too early to conclude that the economy remains resilient to the increased tariff war risks.
Chinese new bank loans surged in the month of June, tripling the amount in May and beating analysts' forecasts. That's with stimulus measures boosting credit demand during the US-China trade truce. Roughly $313 billion worth were given out in June, far exceeding the $91 billion in May. However, new loans were still down from the first 6 months of this year as compared with last year, down about 2.6%. Both corporate and household lending rose. The prolonged property slump in the world's second biggest economy had dampened sentiment earlier, and continuing trade tensions also weighing on borrowers' sentiment. But Beijing introduced broad stimulus measures in May to counter the effects of US tariffs and also managed to strike a framework agreement in June over trade. The central bank last month pledged to continue loose monetary policy and would guide financial institutions to step up credit supply. Singapore has registered its largest public listing in 8 years. NTT DC REIT debuted on the Singapore Exchange, ending the day steady with its offer price of $1 US. Exchange executives hope the IPO will give a much-needed boost to the local market, which has seen lackluster interest for major listings in recent years.
We're seeing an increase in activity. As you've seen, the STI index has hit an all-time high. With the efforts collectively by the review group and the market ecosystem, there's clearly optimism amongst the issuers that we're speaking to, whether internationally, regionally, or locally.
Valued at over $750 million US, the REIT counts Singapore's sovereign wealth fund, GIC, as a cornerstone investor, and it's backed by Japanese telecom giant NTT. Earlier, I spoke with the president and CEO of NTT Global Data Centers, Doug Adams, on why the decision was made to list in Singapore.
We looked at a lot of different vehicles. We looked at American REITs. We looked at Japanese REITs, obviously as being a Japanese company. We quickly honed in on the Singapore REITs. And this is a long process. We've done this we've been about 2 years in the making for this REIT, believe it or not. What we found attractive about the Singapore REITs is a few things. One, we are able to bolt this onto our capital structure and still manage the infrastructure, which was important to us. Singapore REITs are actually very receptive to global assets. We're the third largest global data center provider, and so having a REIT that is interested in having global assets was important to us. Japanese REITs really don't like that. U.S. REITs is the same way. In addition to that, with the Singapore REIT, you go out with your initial IPO and then you drip feed assets over time. U.S. REITs don't really like that. They want to have one big REIT and they don't want to have continued use of assets being fed into it. And so for us, we're in a very scale-oriented business. Data centers, when I started 25 years ago, were 10 megawatts. Now they're approaching 100 megawatts. Our largest facilities are actually 100 megawatts. That's enough to power 100,000 homes. With that scale comes scale for people, for supply chain, and for capital. So we spend about $3 billion a year building our portfolio, and having access to the Singapore REIT is very strategic to us. I think that given the macroeconomics and what's happening within the globe, we're very excited about this REIT launch. I think investors are looking for stable assets that have a good return, that have a global risk portfolio. And so from our perspective, we're pleased, and I think we're going to continue to see the success.
Mr. Adams also shared his outlook on the data center market in Asia, buoyed by optimism that the CAGR, or compounded annual growth rate, has risen significantly.
The data center market is amazing. The tailwinds from AI and from cloud have been propelling it for the last 5 to 10 years. We've seen an incredible turn within the last 2 years just because of AI. The CAGR 2 years ago for growth, for 5-year CAGR, was 13.5%. The new CAGR is projected at 23%, and that's based mostly on AI. So although most of the AI we're seeing is getting installed in the U.S. at this point, it's starting to transfer into India. We're starting to see it transfer into Asia. So we're very bullish on the outlook for Asia in general, because the cloud market's expanding faster than the rest of the world. There's the adoption's not as high. So we think there's a lot of opportunity for cloud. And then AI, everything that you see, every product you buy is being powered by AI.
A Japanese government-backed chipmaker, JS Foundry, has filed for bankruptcy, leaving an outstanding debt in excess of $100 million. The company produces power semiconductors that are typically used in EVs, home appliances, and trains. Markets for these have been declining since the second half of 2023 as demand for electric vehicles, once expected to grow rapidly, fell short of projections. That, coupled with stiff competition from Chinese manufacturers, has hit JS Foundry's bottom line. The company registered less than $18 million in sales for the year ending December 24. JS Foundry isn't the only one. Another major Japanese chipmaker also suffering setbacks from its investments in power semiconductors amid broader turmoil in the power semiconductor industry. And that's it for business. Wei Su, back to you.
And thanks for that, Roland. And still ahead on East Asia tonight, 12 Hong Kong pro-democracy activists appeal their subversion convictions in a national security case that has put a spotlight on Beijing's crackdown on dissent. And how will North Korea's increasingly close ties with Russia affect Pyongyang's ties with its long-standing ally, China? We check in with Steve Sun from the University of London in just a moment. Stay with us. This is East Asia tonight, and here are the headlines. China's exports grew at a faster clip in June, topping market estimates after a tentative deal with the US eased trade tensions. This is in focus for Australia's Prime Minister in China, Anthony Albanese, to meet the leaders, but in Shanghai first, touting green steel as a way to balance a crucial export with the need to cut emissions. And the Chinese Foreign Minister hailing ties with Moscow as the world's most strategically valuable on a visit by Russia's top diplomat. U.S. Special Envoy Keith Kellogg has arrived in Ukraine to discuss its ongoing war with Russia. This comes as U.S. President Donald Trump pledged Patriot missiles to support the Ukrainian effort. Mr. Trump also expected to make a major statement about Russia today, with fresh sanctions likely on the cards to press Moscow to return to the negotiating table.
We're not paying anything for it, but we will send it. It'll be business for us, and we will send them Patriots, which they desperately need.
Mr. Trump said to meet NATO chief Mark Rutte later today. They are expected to discuss the arms package to Ukraine, which Mr. Trump said would be delivered through NATO and paid for 100% by the bloc. The war in Ukraine, also a key issue discussed between Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi in Beijing. In that meeting, the top diplomat telling Mr. Lavrov that ties between Beijing and Moscow are the most stable and the most valuable relationship in the world today. The two sides declared a so-called no-limits partnership in 2022, just days before Moscow launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Mr. Wang says the current focus for both sides is to deepen cooperation, promote development and revitalization, and also to jointly respond to challenges amid a turbulent and changing world. The Russian Foreign Minister was in North Korea earlier, meeting leader Kim Jong-un over the weekend. Mr. Kim pledged unwavering support for Moscow's fight against Kyiv. Dasha Chernyshyova with more from Moscow.
North Korea has unconditional support for Russia to fundamentally resolve the Ukraine situation. That's according to North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, who received Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov for talks. Lavrov described the relationship between the two countries as an invincible fighting brotherhood that was proven while fighting during the months-long campaign to oust the Ukrainian troops from Russia's Kursk region. Lavrov also thanked North Korea for the troops it had sent to Russia. The North Korean troop deployment is an example of deepening ties between Moscow and Pyongyang. Pyongyang is also expected to help Moscow rebuild its Kursk region. The visit was described as the continuation of strategic dialogue between the two sides inaugurated by Russian President Vladimir Putin's visit to North Korea last year. In a message passed on by Lavrov, Putin said he hoped for more direct contacts in future, although no specific timeline has been set out. The visit, Lavrov's third trip since October 2023, comes as Moscow is advancing on several directions in Ukraine and now also aims to create a buffer zone to be protected from Kyiv's attacks. During his trip, Lavrov also met with his North Korean counterpart, Choi Soon-hee. Russia and North Korea also say they plan to resume maritime links without specifying when. And Moscow says it respects and understands the reasons why Pyongyang is developing its nuclear program, and noted that technologies used by North Korea are the result of the work of its own scientists. Dasha Chernyshyova, CNA, Moscow.
Observers will be watching how China is positioning itself with this close alignment between Moscow and Pyongyang. North Korea last week reaffirming commitment to China as it marks the 64th anniversary of their mutual defense treaty. State media seeing it as a reinforcement of the commitment to strategic cooperation, especially at a time when international peace and security are under threat. But increasing military alignment between Pyongyang and Moscow testing Beijing's capacities to balance its own interests. Beijing has maintained a neutral stance on Ukraine while positioning itself as a peacemaker. It served as an economic lifeline for Russia while insisting it has provided no weapons. Although Foreign Minister Wang Yi was reported recently confirming that Beijing would not want to see Russia lose its war in Ukraine. Beijing later clarified no change in its stance, which remains to seek a ceasefire and eventual peace. And Steve Sung, director of the SOAS China Institute at the University of London, joins us with his insights on this. Professor Sung, Wang Yi in the EU earlier this month telling the EU's top foreign policy chief that he would prefer not to see Russia lose its war in Ukraine. Beijing clarified that later, but perhaps, Mr. Wang, did unintentionally reveal Beijing's actual preference for this war in Ukraine?
Well, China's position on the Ukraine war has been consistently inconsistent. From the very start of the invasion, the policy has been one of declaring neutrality, supporting Putin, and not paying any price on the part of China, which accounts for the strong support China has provided for Russia, but short of triggering any type of secondary sanctions against China.
And it's consistently inconsistent because Beijing, while it might be slightly uncomfortable with alignment between Russia and North Korea, it does not want to see Russia lose this war. And North Korea, to all intents and purposes, by helping Russia, is in fact serving Beijing's interests.
Well, I think you're right there that the Chinese government would have preferred North Korea to be more dependent on China and not building up a strong partnership with Russia. But the priority here is one of making sure that Russia, in particular, President Putin, will not lose the war in Ukraine, and North Korean participation and supply of weapons and soldiers to the Russian military efforts in Ukraine has been helpful to the Russian cause and therefore serving the wider strategic interest of China itself.
So at this point, and these interests change all the time, for Russia, the overriding concern now is winning this war and therefore surviving this current regime. For North Korea, what might its interests be? For China, you've just laid out some of its basic interests, but if you very quickly lay out each one and how they coincide at this point, so we're seeing status quo in terms of relations between these three powers.
Well, as you say, in the case of Russia, it's quite simply a matter that Putin has put his reputation on the invasion. He cannot afford to not succeed in his ambitions to effectively reduce Ukraine to a Russian dependency. In the case of North Korea, it does want to have greater strategic autonomy from its overwhelming dependence on China. It also has an enormous stock of old weapons and ammunition, which would need to be replaced and updated. And providing them to Russia would be a useful way for them to do so. And the provision of North Korean combat troops also gave the North Korean military experience in a modern setting that they would not otherwise be able to gain. And for the Chinese, it really is primarily a matter of making sure that Putin does not lose the war and therefore does not lose power in Russia. For the simple reason that if that should be allowed to happen, it could set a very bad example to what could happen to Xi Jinping should Xi Jinping make a major policy blunder, and that's just not acceptable.
Okay, so if I could sum that up, for North Korea, it's win-win. It's got weapons it doesn't need that are going to expire effectively, so might as well send them to Russia and buy support in return. Russia may be slightly concerned with upsetting Beijing, hence you've got Mr. Lavrov heading to China to reassure China. For China, the win is a longer-term one, hoping this war in Ukraine plays out to its own interest. But meanwhile, and I can quote you on this, North Korea is the ally from hell.
Well, from the Chinese perspective, North Korea is indeed an ally from hell. And a military alliance like that is meant to be two-way. But in reality, China is exposed to the risk of having to come to North Korea's defense without much hope that North Korea could be of much help to China in the event of China facing a military confrontation with the United States. And it is an ally that goes its own way and often do so at the expense of China's clear strategic interests, such as the non-nuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. That is happening under Kim Jong-un.
All right. The difficult, as you say, North Korea goes its own way, and then you've got different countries, and this involves Russia as well, putting pressure on China. You see that from the European Union saying, well, if you want to improve your relations with us, you need to put some pressure on North Korea to rein in its nuclear weapons program. You need to put pressure on Russia to stop its war in Ukraine. How much leverage does China really have with these slightly errant partners it has as neighbors? And even if it had that power, as you say, there's very little reason for China at this point, given its other interests, to actually exercise that power.
We have to bear in mind that China is a rising power, getting very, very close to being a superpower itself. And China under Xi Jinping works hugely on the basis of its own agency and agenda. It does not simply react and respond to pressure from the outside. So whether we are talking about the European Union trying to put pressure on China to rein in Russia, the reality is that the Chinese will go its own way and they will not simply do what the European Union asks them to do. And likewise, within the Asia-Pacific region, who can actually put pressure on China to get China to do something that Beijing does not actually itself want to do? I don't see any regional partner of China in the Asia-Pacific being able to do so.
The only pressure that can be put to bear on China, it's China's own interest. Thanks a lot for joining us this evening. Professor Steve Sung, Director of the SOAS China Institute, speaking to us from London. Australia is hosting its largest ever war-fighting exercise, Talisman Sabre, involving more than 35,000 troops from 19 countries. Participants include the US, the UK, Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, amongst others. This year's exercise will also take part in Papua New Guinea. Will also involve the participation, or also be carried out in Papua New Guinea, the first time the drills are being held outside of Australia. Talisman Sabre started in 2005 as a biennial exercise between the US and Australia.
The environment having changed now, where our focus is very much in the region and in the homeland, the shifting availability of military technology means that countries don't have to come close to Australia as they did in the past. We had thought the sea-air gap, the waters to our north, were a great protective buffer. Well, modern weaponry very quickly traverses that gap.
Australian defence officials say Chinese surveillance ships have monitored the last 4 Talisman Sabre exercises and are expected to do so again. The court in Hong Kong has begun hearing appeals from 12 jailed democracy activists, a process expected to take about 10 days. They were convicted last year in the city's largest national security trial since the enactment of a security law in 2020. Heavy police presence was seen outside West Kowloon Court as the hearing began. The activists were among 45 opposition figures sentenced over a 2020 primary election, which authorities say was a plot to subvert the government. Some have already spent more than 4 years behind bars. The case has drawn international criticism and remains a flashpoint in Beijing's crackdown on dissent. The special counsel in South Korea that is given the task of investigating a failed bid for martial law by ousted leader Yoon Suk-yeol has raided the Drone Operations Command and the Defense Ministry. Local media say the latest move suggests a widening of the ongoing insurrection probe into treason charges. Yoon is suspected of ordering the military to send drones to Pyongyang in October last year in a bid to provoke a response from North Korea, and through that justify the imposition of martial law in December. Investigators were sent to 24 locations to obtain related evidence, amongst them reportedly a recording of a military officer suggesting that Yoon gave instructions for the preparation of the drone mission. Allegations of a military cover-up, including modification to drones to carry anti-North Korea leaflets, are also being looked into. Pyongyang last year discovered drone debris in its capital and accused Seoul of sending them. It's warned of retaliation if that act should be repeated. Thousands of medical students in South Korea set to return to school after a months-long boycott. A timeline for the return, though, has yet to be confirmed. A spokesperson for the Korean Medical Association says it was up to medical institutions themselves to decide on that schedule. South Korea's healthcare system was plunged into chaos last year after a government decision to increase medical school admissions triggered nationwide protests. The then-President Yoon Suk-yeol defended the move, citing the need for doctors amid the industry's growing demand. But after 17 months, students now say they are ending their boycott to avoid, quote, the collapse of the fundamentals of medical systems. Prime Minister Kim Min-seok welcomed that decision, calling it a big step forward. He adds that President Lee Jae-myung is looking at ways to solve this issue. Still led on East Asia tonight, the European Union to urge China to ditch coal-fired power plants as they hold talks on climate action in Beijing. Plus, could the return of K-pop powerhouse BTS pull Korea's economy out of the doldrums? We'll explore that in just a moment. China and the European Union holding high-level talks focusing on the environment and climate action. Officials from both sides said to pore over each other's plans before making their submissions to the COP30 UN climate talks in November. The EU Climate Commissioner, who is in Beijing for these talks, praised China for adding more renewables to its energy mix, but said the country needs to stop building new coal-fired power plants and eventually end the use of highly polluting fossil fuel.
China has been doing domestically very well in terms of renewables, solar and wind in particular. It also implies that we need to phase down and ultimately phase out fossil fuels. And China clearly has work to do also in the domain of phasing out coal. And it means that the world at large cannot solve the climate problem without a Chinese leadership.
China has been rapidly building renewable energy sources as well as more advanced nuclear power plants. But the economy is still hungry for power, and that means a rising number of coal power plants still in the pipeline. China is already the world's largest producer of greenhouse gas emissions. The European Union is holding off on signing a joint climate declaration unless Beijing first pledges to do more to cut its emissions in its so-called Nationally Determined Contribution, or the NDC.
We do think there is an opportunity for China to significantly drive down emissions and articulate that ambition in its NDC. And that is, in our view, one of the true areas of focus in our collaboration ahead of the COP.
The EU is looking to develop a satellite network with Japan to cut reliance on US-based companies such as SpaceX. Nikkei Asia says the move could see both sides jointly launching and operating these satellites. But unlike SpaceX, which intends to deploy more than 40,000 satellites, or China's plan to have 10,000, the draft agreement suggests the EU plans to employ fewer than 300, while Japan is targeting more than 5 satellite systems in less than a decade. There are also plans for their defense industries to work together to boost supply chains and possibly develop military equipment. The two sides reportedly planning a meeting between EU officials and Japanese leader Shigeru Ishiba in Tokyo next week. The return of K-pop phenomenon BTS is raising hopes of a boost to South Korea's economy, which has been weighed down by political turmoil at home and uncertainties from US tariffs. CNA's senior Korea correspondent Lim Yeon-sok tells us more.
The Black Drunk Cafe in Seoul is decked out in BTS merchandise. Even the customers are all BTS fans, known as ARMY. And that includes owner Kim Young-sun, who opened the cafe 6 years ago. She says business had been slow until a month ago, when BTS members were discharged from compulsory military service.
우리 애들 파워가 아직 안 죽었다. 네, 뭐 죽지 않을 거라는 건 알고 있었지만 이렇게까지 진짜 이번에는 너무 아미들이 참고 있었잖아요. 그동안 이제 참았던 게 터진 거죠. 3년 동안 애들 이제 군대 간 동안 참았던 게 이번에 이제 빵 터진 거죠. 그래서 진짜 깔릴 뻔했어요.
The group's reunion is breathing life back into parts of Seoul. Businesses in Seoul are already seeing the benefits of BTS return. Fans have flocked into places with any connection to the group, such as cafes and restaurants. Fans from around the world are traveling to South Korea to celebrate BTS's return. Crowds gathered for an annual fan event held last month in Goyang City, about 23 kilometers from Seoul.
I'm from Malaysia, coming to Korea just for BTS only. For me, I think they will be boost up. We can't wait to see what they coming out for the next album, for the next chapters.
I am so glad that they're back. But yeah, I'm super excited to hear their new music, their new projects. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Other events included this exhibition of fan-made artwork of BTS members in the capital. BTS will make its comeback as a full group with a new album and tour next year in spring. Hopes are high that this will reinvigorate the K-pop market after album sales declined last year following a decade of steady growth. The Korea Culture and Tourism Institute previously estimated that a single BTS concert in Seoul could inject up to 1.22 trillion won, or about $895 million into the Korean economy and create as many as 10,000 jobs.
BTS가 또 한 번의 활약을 한다면 경제적인 효과나 어떤 이제 국가 브랜드에 관련된 어떤 효과들이 또 한층 더 크게 작용을 할 수 있지 않을까라는 기대를 하게 됩니다. BTS는 그 팬층이 너무나 탄탄하기 때문에 수면하에 있던 팬심들이 다시 한번 올라오고 그러면은 이 탄탄한 팬층을 바탕으로 또 한 번의 도약을 할 수 있지 않을까라고 기대를 합니다.
Ms. Che says the group's global influence has already transformed the country's image in ways that are not easily quantifiable.
대표에서 한국을 알려주고 있다. BTS를 통해서 한국에 관심을 갖게 된 친구들이 직접 한국에 관광을 오고 한국의 문화도 경험하고 그런 것들이 궁극적으로 한국에 다 긍정적인 효과가 있지 않을까라고 생각을 합니다. 그거를 일일이 경제적 효과가 얼마라고 얘기하는 것 자체가 사실은 좀 무의미하지 않을까.
But for fans, they're just happy to be able to support their idols again. And if this is anything to go by, many in South Korea are anxiously waiting for BTS comeback. Lim Yan-suk, CNA, Seoul.
And that's East Asia Tonight. Headlines anytime at cna.asia, plus on Facebook and YouTube.